Happy Monday, everybody. Every Monday I go over my best of one, best of three meta review for Outlaws of Thunder Junction, and we are on to week 11. And so right now, the standard challenge that I like to use for Magic the Gathering Online is bugged. So we're not actually able to see the deck lists from those tournaments that I usually use to track best of three. So what I've done this week is I'm going to be going over a summary of the top performing best of three decks. Sorry, maybe I said best of one. Best of three decks, and kind of comparing them to what we saw in the last little bit of the standard challenge that we did have. And apparently I have a ghost that's showing up right now on my camera. All right, so we're going to start things off here with Orzhov Midrange by Cabeza de Bolo. And if we compare this one to, I love the name, by the way. if we compare this to week 9 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, which was the last week that I was able to cover the best of three lists from the standard challenge, we can see that they brought in a couple of cards. So what I like to do here is I like to mention the cards that are being brought in and the cards that are being brought out as a way to kind of familiarize yourself with what is considered the core, right? So like if the cards are coming in and out, you can kind of consider them flex spots, and it can be really helpful for those who are new or returning to standard and to get an idea of what's going on with the deck. So Orzhov Midrange is one of those that can really go a very aggressive route, or it can be a little bit more of a controlling route. And so back in week 9 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, we had a deck by Ariane, which was running a lot more planeswalkers and taking a little bit more of a control approach. Whereas this one, I think, is going strictly more towards the aggressive, let's end the game quickly, right? So we've got an additional copy of Aclazots. We have the additional copy of the Graveyard Trespasser, as well as 2 copies of Shieldred the Apocalypse. And so we're running a little bit more creatures, a little bit more threats, rather than just the strictly control build. We've dropped 1 less Duress, no Sorn the Mirthless, and then 1 less copy of Liliana of the Veil. So all of these are going to make it a little bit worse. The Duress and Lily are really good against the Azorius Control matchups, for example, whereas Sorin the Mirthless is really good for the lifelink and stabilization against the Dimir Aggro and the mono red. And we're also bringing in the Mishra's Foundries instead of the Myrics, and that's kind of another sign that, like, if the deck is running Myrics, it's going a little bit more controlling. If the deck is running the Mishra's Foundry, it's going a little bit more aggressive. And we're also seeing a pulling out the Restless Fortress and a Swamp for Shadowy Backstreet, and a complete reworking of the best of three sideboard, right? So Ariane had a specific meta in mind when they did the sideboard for the last standard challenge in Magic the Gathering Online. So this one is going to be a little bit more teched for a different meta. And so we're dropping the 2 copies of the Hostile Investigators. Again, another card that's good against the Azorius Control matchup. Dropping the 1 Lauren of the Third Path. And that one's good against the enchantments that we typically see in the Virtue of Loyalty and Wedding Announcement builds of Esper Midrange, the new Orzhov Midrange, as well as the Case of the Gateway Express and War Leader's Call in Boros Convoke. And taking out 1 Cut Down and a Depopulate, a Gix's Command, which is really good, the Wrath for the Boros Convoke matchup, 2 Knockout Blows, which was specifically for the Surge of Mono Red, and taking out the Legion to Ashes, which is a Boros Convoke tech, as well as 2 temporary lockdowns, and the Tokashia's Welcome, which gives you some of the card draw when your tokens are entering the battlefield. And instead, we're bringing in an additional copy of Get Lost, and this one does give you the enchantment hate that you kind of are getting from Lauren of the Third Path, and bringing in 4 copies of the Invasion of Gobakon. And this one is really going to be for affecting the tempo of some of your decks, more so than it is protecting from a Wrath. So if you go back and you look at my best of 3 sideboard guide, I think for Esper Midrange, I talk about the Invasion of Gobakon. And basically, it's really good against the Esper Midrange lists to be able to get rid of Raffine on turn 3. So any deck that's got a critical piece on turn 3, Invasion of Gobakon, then you can exile it and make it 2 more to cast. It also works with the Virtue of Loyalty, kind of just pumping your board, and the general go-wide theme that is running off of the tokens from Wandering Emperor and the Wedding Announcement. and running 2 Path of Perils instead of the temporary lockdowns, and the 2 pest controls as well. So this is one that we got in Outlaws of Thunder Junction that is pretty good at destroying the token decks of Boros Convoke. And we're also bringing in 3 copies of the Unlicensed Hearse, and this one is particularly good for the 5-color, 4-color Legends Slogurk deck, as well as the Temur Landfall deck. Both have cards in their graveyard that they want to be bringing back. Second up here is Mono Red Aggro, and I think that Orzhov Midrange and Mono Red Aggro from the last data that I saw were relatively well positioned in the best of 3 meta. At least in the tournament scene, it's always a little bit different when you're talking about the arena best of 3 ladder. That being said, though, this is a Mono Red Aggro list by Lawrence, and if we compare this one to Week 9, which was the last time I covered Best of 3, we can see that they decided to cut 2 copies of the Charming Scoundrel and bring in 3 copies of Squee, Dubious Monarch, and 2 copies of the Phoenix Chick, and these pair really nicely with each other. Squee helping you go wide, and then if you're going wide, you can bring back the Phoenix Chick. So if you're cutting out the Squee, then it makes sense to drop the Phoenix Chick, and then dropping 1 copy of the Lightning Strike, the 3 copies of the Scorching Shot, and the 4 copies of the Urbrask's Forge, to run 2 additional copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy and 3 copies of the Obliterating Bolt. And personally, I like the Obliterating Bolt more than I like the Scorching Shot. I think that being able to exile problematic threats like Squee, anything like that you don't want coming back, or that gets value by being in the graveyard, Obliterating Bolt takes care of that. So like Dinnick as well. And but we're not getting rid of the Forge entirely. It is still in the sideboard. So as far as the best of 3 sideboard, we can see that they ditched the 2 copies of the Furnace Punisher, which is nice for the decks that are using the non-basic lands. You can kind of punish them. So like Domain, Esper Midrange, a lot of those 3-4 color space need a lot of lands to make that work. We're dropping the 3 copies of the Lithomantic Barrage, which is typically included as a good sideboard option against blue and white, so particularly Esper Midrange, and somewhat Azorius Control. And then we're bringing in an additional copy of the Soul Guide Lantern. The previous builder had ditched one of the Soul Guide Lanterns for an Unlicensed Hearse, so dropping the 1 Unlicensed Hearse for the Lantern. And then the 4 copies of the Urbrask's Forge in the sideboard. So if you want to know the specific matchups, usually the longer the matchup is going, the better Urbrask's Forge becomes. So you're going to want to side this in against like Azorius Control and some of the mid-range decks. It depends on how much artifact hate they naturally have. Like Golgari Midrange has the Terra Sunder. If you want, again, if you go back and you look at my Mono Red Best of 3 sideboard guide, I did cover what decks what matchups I think the Urbrask's Forge is particularly nice for. Generally, it's worse the faster and more aggressive meta that we're seeing, so I like it in the sideboard right now, since we are seeing a spike in the aggressive Orzhov Midrange builds and the Mono Red Aggro builds. And but you can then bring that one in. We're bringing in... See, I have it in my notes that we're adding 2 copies of the Witchstalker Frenzy, but that is incorrect. Sorry. We are bringing in an additional copy of Koth, Fire of Resistance. And so this one is particularly nice against the white sweepers. So Temporary Lockdown, Depopulate, Sunfall, all of those aren't going to be affecting Planeswalkers. So then Koth, Fire of Resistance gives you this alternative threat that can be difficult for your opponent to remove. Okay, now for Tier 2, and Boros Convoke is looking relatively well positioned. This one is by SWAT FA, and if we compare this one to Week 8, which is the last time I talked about Boros Convoke in Best of 3, we can see that they decided to cut the 2 copies of the Nurturing Pixie, as well as 3 copies of the Sanguine Evangelist, leaning more heavily into War Leader's Call. So usually you see Sanguine Evangelist or War Leader's Call kind of a give and take, and they both have their upsides depending on the matchups. Deciding to bring in the Yoshin Frontliner just as a 1 copy that we can also hit with the Gleeful Demolition, and bringing in an additional copy of, or bringing back the copy of Get Lost. If you've listened to me ever, I really like the Get Lost. I think that it has a lot of really good targets to hit, and you can hit like a Temporary Lockdown, which is one of the typical sideboards brought in against Boros Convoke. Get Lost being able to destroy that and get your creatures back. We also have the 4 copies of the War Leader's Call. Again, similar to the Urbrask's Forge, this one's going to be better against the more grindy matchups. The longer the game goes, the more damage that you get off of the creature ETBs and the benefits of the War Leader's Call. And we're also bringing in an additional copy of Cavern of Souls and dropping the 2 Myrics and bringing in my least favorite card in the archetype, Sundown Pass. And then for the best of 3 sideboard, we've got... We're dropping the 2 copies of the Anointed Peacekeeper, being able to target something specifically from their hand. If you're on the play, getting rid of the temporary lockdown. Wasn't exactly sure what the creator was originally planning with that one, to be honest. The 2 copies of Lauren of the Third Path, which were being included for if you are running the 4 case and the 4 War Leader's Call, which not every list is, then Enchantment Hate can be good in the mirror match. And then the 2 copies of Thalia, Guardian of Thraben, can be useful in the mirror match as well because of the first strike. Again, if you go look at my best of 3 sideboard guide for Boros Convoke, I go into more detail. We've got we're dropping the 2 copies of Destroy Evil, again, less Enchantment Hate, and 1 copy of the Legion Extruder. And there was a Legion Extruder in the main in this build as well that has been removed, and it's a way to kind of get additional value out of your artifacts other than the Gleeful Demolitions. And we were dropping the 2 copies of Wedding Announcement, which I thought was kind of a weird inclusion in the first place. And then we're bringing in 3 more copies of Get Lost. So if you're in a matchup that really wants that Enchantment Hate, then you're going to bring in all of your copies of Get Lost. Similarly, we see 4 copies of Invasion of Gobakon, like we did in the Orzhov Midrange. This is particularly good against the Esper Midrange of making Rafine happen on turn 5. And we've also got 1 copy of Myrics. So sometimes you'll see a land in the sideboard. It really depends on how pro we're being, because when you're on the play, you need more lands in your deck than when you're on the draw, because you're going to draw more cards by a certain time, right? So like turn 1, you don't draw a card on the play. Turn 1, you do on the draw. So if you're on the play, you might want to be bringing in the Myrics to kind of up your land count if you're getting really, really spicy about every little percentage gain. And then 3 copies of the Urbrask's Forge. Again, this one being a good answer if you're up against a deck that struggles with the artifact control and is more of a mid-range or control match themselves. And, I'm trying to go through this quickly because I've got 7 best of 3 decks I want to cover and 8 best of 1 decks that I want to cover. So if you don't know what any of these decks are, you can always go back and look at other videos that I've done in the past where I talk about the archetypes a little bit more, about their just like base strategy and such. And also keep in mind that this is the last season that we will be having before the rotation on August 2nd. So this is the last time to really give these decks a whirl before we lose some of the cards in the standard rotation. That being said, Esper Midrange has been around for quite some time. This list is by Luke Deretzu, and if we compare this to week 6, so 5 weeks ago I talked about Esper Midrange in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. It is the exact same list, except for we have 1 additional copy of the Urtai Resurrected. We kind of see this one come and go depending on... It pairs nicely with the Fairy Mastermind, being able to offset the... card draw off of the downside with Urtai Resurrected is it makes your opponents draw a card, and then Fairy Mastermind, you get to draw a card as long as you are flashing it in on their turn, so they're drawing their second card. And to bring in this one, Urtai Resurrected, we're dropping a Gix's Command. Again, I think this one signals a little bit that Boros Convoke has fallen a little bit out of favor, where Gix's Command is a particularly nice board wipe for that matchup. As far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, there's also no change from the list that I covered in week 6. All right, number 5 is Temur Control, and this is another one that, similar to Boros Convoke and the Esper Midrange, is kind of considered in tier 2, and this one is a list by Tristan Wild LaRue. And if we compare this, we have to go all the way back to week 4, which was the last time I talked about Temur Control in best of 3 specifically. And this one is deciding to drop the Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy. Again, I have a sideboard guide that talks about which matchups Kellen is good for. Not off the top of my head, I can't totally remember. The body is helpful against some of the early aggression, if I remember. But instead, we're leaning towards the Sky Turtle loop. And this one's a pretty common inclusion, usually in the sideboard if it's not in the main. And so this one deciding to main board the Colossal Sky Turtle, and as well as bring in one copy of the Doppelgang, which can give you an alternative win condition if your opponent has an answer for the World Soul's Rage. And then we're bringing a third copy of the Fires of Victory. This one is being particularly good against the early aggression, to have that early interaction to slow our opponent down. So usually the faster decks you see in the meta, then you're going to see Fires of Victory coming in as a answer to that. And we're dropping one Ill-Timed Explosion and bringing in an additional copy of Spelunking. And then the lands are... we're tweaking the lands a little bit too. Usually you see Cabaretti Courtyard as 4 copies and the Riveteer's Outlook as 1. But they decided to flip the script on this one and change that to this being at 2 and the Cabaretti Courtyard being at 2. They brought in 2 Riveteer's Overlooks and took out 2 Cabaretti Courtyards. Relatively minor change. As far as the best of 3 sideboard, though, we do see quite a difference from when I talked about it in week 4. And so this one, not running the Bonnie Pauls, the Colossal Sky Turtle has been moved to the main, and the Tyrannix Rex have all been removed. They're bringing in an additional copy of the Titan of Industry, as well as 2 copies of Thrun, Breaker of Silence, or Thrun. And this basically being like, if they do have a whole bunch of negates and a whole bunch of non-creature spell hate that they bring in game 2, then what we can do is we can sideboard in our own creatures, then make it more of like that have some ability to just close out the game by themselves. So as alternative win conditions if we're experiencing a lot of specific hate. And they also dropped the 3 Steps Ahead, which was being explored as a one of, and dropped the Vampire's Vengeance down to a single copy. And again, I don't know if this is a signal that Boros Convoke has just kind of been decreasing in popularity abroad. We do see an additional copy of a Braid, giving us some artifact hate, which I think signals the mono red, with the giving you an answer for Urbrask's Forge, and Doppelgang, an additional copy of Doppelgang, and an additional copy of Negate. Going to bring in the negates against their negates to kind of play the counterspell battle. Sorry, I had to tweak the autofocus on my camera because it was going in and out. Okay, so with that, let's get into number 6. So this is what is now, this is kind of like tier 3, according to what I was looking at. And Dimir Midrange is really preying on the presence of mono-red aggro. So it's very positive win rate against mono-red, if I remember correctly. And again, another one that I've covered in my best of 3 sideboard guides that I probably will be repeating for after rotation. We'll see. They didn't perform particularly well. So this is Dimir Midrange by Rem F. And Rem F has been the master of Dimir Midrange for the Magic the Gathering online tournaments, and just really likes the archetype and does quite well with it. And so if we compare this to week 9, which was also a list by Rem F, we can see that this one is deciding to drop 1 copy of the Urtai Resurrected, so only 1 there, and drop the 2 copies of the Gix Yawgmoth Praetor, and this is because we're dropping the 4 copies of the Spyglass Siren. So if you're going to play the Spyglass Sirens, or more importantly, if you're going to play the 4 copies of Gix, then you're going to want that early evasion that the Spyglass Sirens are offering you. Also, the token production off of the Preacher of the Schism, because this list was dropping the 4 copies of the Preacher of Schism, and instead we're bringing in the Graveyard Trespasser to give us some hate against the Graveyard for Temur Control and the Legends decks. And also running 1 copy of the Caustic Bronco. And this one we saw kind of come in and then be explored and then be cut out, and then so settling on 1 copy here. And 2 copies of the Tenacious Underdog. The recurring threat from the graveyard can be problematic depending on how good your opponent is at attacking the graveyard. So the Graveyard Trespassers are also going to improve the matchup in the mirror against other people running the Tenacious Underdog. And we've also got the 2 copies of the Tishana's Tidebinder. This one particularly good for Azorius Control, being able to silence the Planeswalkers and make them entirely useless. We also have 2 copies of Duress to help up against the Azorius Control matchup. And to make room for it, we're cutting out 1 copy of Make Disappear, and and running a Spell Pierce. And we've got 2 copies of Liliana of the Veil. Again, another one that's particularly good against the Azorius Control matchup by attacking their hand, and is also really good against the Golgari midrange matchup, where you can get rid of a Glissa, basically. And as far as the lands go, we're dropping 1 island to run a 4th copy of Mirix in case we come up against a really grindy control matchup. As far as the best of 3 sideboard, we've moved the 2 copies of Tachana's Tidebinder from the sideboard to the main. We took out the 1 Blot Out, which is particularly good for hating on Aclazot's Deepest Betrayal, and we took out the Spell Pierce and brought it into the main, as well as 1 copy of the Liliana, so we still have 1 in the sideboard. If it's a particularly favorable matchup, we could bring in Lily. And then we've got 1 copy of Cut Down, which I like the inclusion because we do see more mono red, and 2 copies of the Dreams of Steel and Oil, which is a way to hate on our opponent's artifacts, specifically like Urbrask's Forge. And 1 additional copy of Negate. Again, you could use this to respond to an Urbrask's Forge. I think you also bring this in against the Sunfalls and Sweepers of white. And then we've got 2 copies of Unlicensed Hearse, this proving to be the most common sideboard for the Graveyard Hate for Legends and Temur Landfall. All right, let's see how far this little yellow glitch goes before I get done with all of this. All right, so Azorius Control will wrap up the best of 3 scene, and so this one was by Philip Christopher Rama, and if we compare this one to the list that I covered last, which was in week 7, we can see that they decided to drop 1 Tachana's Tidebinder. Notably, Azorius Control has dropped in popularity in the tournament scene, and so we don't need as much specific hate for it. Dropping 1 copy of the Deduce and bringing out 1 Sunfall, but bringing in a sweeper to replace it with Farewell, and then again, this being more relevant in the Graveyard Hate, and then an additional copy of Get Lost. And I like this because we saw Get Lost get removed because largely because Esper Midrange was exploring ditching the wedding announcements and the Virtue of Loyalties, and we're starting to see a shift back towards that, and starting to see them show up again in Orzhov Midrange, and then the 4/4 split in the Boros Convoke makes enchantment hate more relevant. And then as far as bringing in the 1 copy of Jace, the Perfected Mind, this one giving you an alternative win condition outside of the Manlands and the Wandering Emperor as a way to mill out, especially against the Mirror matchup. And then as far as the lands go, we're dropping 1 Mirrex for an additional Field of Ruin. In the best of 3 sideboard, we see that they dropped the 3 copies of Stoic Sphinx, and this was being explored as a potential kind of threat like the Chromhost Seed Shark, as well as the Hullbreaker Horror. Sometimes you want a large creature threat, especially one that is difficult, like Stoic Sphinx has hexproof, and so you can kind of just end the game if you can get it stuck on the board against a deck like Azorius Control. So it's really for the mirror match most of the time. But we're bringing in an additional copy of the Chromhost Seed Shark, and we're bringing in 1 copy of Elish Norn. This one works particularly well against Boros Convoke, and also kind of messes with the Temur Landfall deck. And bringing in an additional copy of the Kutzel's Flanker. So I really like the 2-1 split of Kutzel's Flanker and Rest in Peace, because Rest in Peace doesn't work well in duplicates. So you're going to be bringing in Flanker and Rest in Peace against the Temur Landfall deck especially. And we're bringing in 1 copy of the Hullbreaker Horror. So like I mentioned, this is just an alternative win condition instead of Jace or through the tokens and Manlands. And to make room for this, we're getting rid of the Get Losts because we moved them to the main, getting rid of the 1 March of Otherworldly Light. So you could have brought in the original, the builder before in week 7 was bringing in the March of Otherworldly Light up to 4 against Boros Convoke to get rid of the Gleeful Demolition target and prevent the turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos. So with a decrease in Boros Convoke, we don't need all 4 copies. The 3 should be fine. Bringing in the 1 copy of Rest in Peace. The other one had just been going with 2 Flankers. And Flanker it fits multiple spaces where Rest in Peace doesn't. Flanker also gains you life and Scry 2, which can be relevant against mono red. So you could also run like a 3rd Flanker instead of the Rest in Peace if you wanted to. And then C double here is also for the Temur Landfall deck, being able to throw back a World Soul's Rage that they're shooting you with. Yours resolves first, so you'll win the game before they shoot you for 20. So that's a little bit of hate that we haven't seen for Temur Control in a while. And again, these lists are the top performers from June that experience a vastly different meta than what you might experience in the standard challenge on Magic the Gathering Online. Whew. All right, I got through it on my time. I was trying to get through all the best of 3 stuff in 30 minutes. hopefully we can get through all of the best of 1 stuff in about 15. Try to keep it around 45 minutes. This is the reason why I'm going super in depth this week, is because it's the last season before rotation. It's the last time to really talk about these decks. So next week I'll be doing a little bit of a shorter one that probably won't cover best of 3 unless the standard challenges get fixed on their website. So first up here, what I like to do is use a tracker called Untapped as a way to look at thousands, if not millions of matches in best of 1, ranging from bronze to mythic. And so these top performing decks may not perform well in your meta, but overall, they work for the vast majority of people. So number 1 this week, as we get back into the last season climb, you're going to see a spike in mono red prowess, and I think the best version of mono red prowess, and the tracker agrees, is Rakdos Aggro. So this was number 1 according to the tracker, and if we compare this one to the one that I was talking about last week, we can kind of see a return to form. So we're dropping 1 Callous Sellsword. Again, if you go back through my videos, you can look at the one that I built, and Callous Sellsword can be awkward when you have nothing on the board and just like 3 Callous Sellswords in hand, right? So I like dropping this. We're dropping the 4 copies of the Fugitive Codebreaker and bringing in Feldon, which gives us some dig if they do decide to block our creature. We also are bringing in the 4 copies of the Slickshot Show-Off. So last week, the Slickshot Show-Off was going away because there was so much targeted hate towards the Slickshot Show-Off. At least that was my speculation. And now Slickshot Show-Off has returned, and this one being really great for your turn 3 win by flinging it at your opponent's face. So we've also got the 4 copies of Ancestral Anger coming back in if we are going to lean more on the prowess instead of just strictly the double strike of the Picnic Ruiners. And also we're bringing in 1 Thelonious Rage, this one pairing particularly nicely with the Picnic Ruiners, being able to give them haste so that they immediately have double strike, and it also works with the Cacophony Scamp, which you can sacrifice with the Callous Sellsword to deal 3 times its power, as long as you decline after it's dealt damage, and then sacrifice it with the Callous Sellsword. You can then also get a 2/2 that spawns after you do that. I've definitely done that sometimes. And the other, we're dropping the Mirren Bane Splitter down 1. This one works particularly well with the Picnic Ruiner. I've been happy with 3 copies. I've been happy with 2. Kind of take it. It's expensive to re-equip, so really you don't want your creatures dying in the first place. That's what this deck is weak to. Going up to 3 copies of the Antagonize, and dropping the 4 copies of the Blazing Crescendo. I kind of like a split between the Antagonize and the Blazing Crescendo personally. But this is what the tracker is suggesting this week. And then we also are dropping the 1 case of the Crimson Pulse, which is a way to get the kind of dig that we're getting off of the Feldons, a way to kind of refuel our hand, especially since we're dropping the Codebreakers. And then as far as the lands go, we are dropping 2 mountains and bringing in a Sokenzon and cutting the Sulphurous Springs, which was the black source, to be able to play the Callous Sellsword. So since we're dropping down to 3, even in the deck that had 4 copies of it, you don't usually play out the Callous Sellsword. All right, number 2, according to the tracker, was Boros Humans, and we have to go all the way back to week 5 of Murders of Karlov Manor for when I talked about this one last. I did briefly talk about it in one of the meta breakers that I do on Sundays, but this list has been around for a while, and it has no changes from week 5 of Murders of Karlov Manor. It's basically mono-white humans with the addition of Imidane's Recruiter to be able to give everything haste, and give you kind of like a board-wide pump. And the splash is relatively free because everything's a human, and we can run the Cavern of Souls as well as the Secluded Courtyard for the red fixing. All right, so another thing to mention, I mentioned it again, I'll mention it several times, hopefully throughout this video. August 2nd is the rotation for Standard, so if you are thinking about crafting any of these decks and you're returning to Magic and you're like, what's going on? Hold off for a month, or go look at my budget builds. All 5 of those archetypes I think are relatively well positioned for rotation, and that's why I made that video. So, because I've had a couple of people be like, hey, why don't you talk about more about which cards are going and whatnot, and it's a lot if I'm trying to cover this many decks in 45 minutes. So, with that being said, number 3 here is Boros Convoke, and similar to Boros Humans, except for leaning a little bit more into the turn 2 Knight Errant of Eos. established or enabled by the Gleeful Demolition. So this week we see a decrease in the 2 Lunarch veterans are being pulled for bringing in the 1 copy of the Ocean Frontliner. This is a pretty typical kind of like you either play the Lunarch veterans or you play the Ocean Frontliner, and then dropping 1 Sanguine Evangelist and still playing the War Leader's Call. And so this one you don't see very often. Usually you see kind of either or. And we are also seeing a increase in the case of the Gateway Express, so going for a 4-3 split. Last week we saw the War Leader's Call being cut and some Lightning Helixes being explored to really address the surge in the mono red prowess that I think we'll actually see again. So curious to see if the tracker picks up on the Lightning Helix build that I talked about last week, since I suspect a surge in mono red prowess. And but bringing in the 3 copies of the War Leader's Call. Don't remember if I mentioned that. We're dropping the 2 copies of Sundown Pass, which is like, thank you, my least favorite card in the archetype. And we're bringing out Mirix as well to bring in an additional copy of Agonjo and Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance, and 1 more Mountain. Okay, now I'm hauling way too quick. It's going to be mostly best of 3. All right. Mono Red Aggro is number 4, and if we compare this one to week 10 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, we can see that they decided to drop the 1 copy of Squee, Dubious Monarch, and bring in a Phoenix Chick, as well as 1 Godric Cloaked Reveler. And the upside to Mono Red Aggro over strictly Mono Red Prowess is it's a little bit more resistant to the single point removal, like Cut Down or Go for the Throat in black. The mirror match of like Play with Fire or Lightning Strikes. The mono red prowess is a little delicate to that, but threats like the Urbresk's Forge and Squee make it so that this deck, it goes a little bit longer and has a little bit more in its arsenal. And that being said, though, we are dropping 1 copy of the Urbresk's Forge, this one being worse in the matchup against mono red, better when you're not up against other mono red decks. And then dropping the Chandra Dress to Kill, which is a card that's better against more of the mono white. So we'll see if there's a surge in Azorius Control. Then you might see the Planeswalker come back. We're running an additional copy of the Witchstalker's Frenzy, which I like with the combination of Squee. So I'm a little bit like interesting to see Witchstalker Frenzy going up, but the go wide payoff from Squee going down kind of feels like opposite directions to me, but that's why I use a tracker, not just my bias. And then we've got the Mountain here being cut down 1 for a additional Sokenzan Crucible of Defiance. So this week, both Mono Red Aggro and Boros Convoke deciding to run 2 of the Neon Dynasty lands, and it's fitting. We only get to play with them for 1 more month, so let's do it. All right, the yellow glitch is starting to get incredibly long here. That's Brutal Cathar behind the yellow blob. And so Mono White Humans was the number 5 according to the tracker. And if we compare this to the list that I talked about last week, there are no changes. I also showcased a gameplay video of this deck specifically. It is teched heavily against mono red. Well, it is teched against mono red prowess by bringing in the March of Otherworldly Light and the Elspeth Smite to be able, and the Agonjos to be able to shoot the Slick Shot Show Off. March of Otherworldly Light also helps against the Boros Convoke matchup, as I mentioned, for hitting the Gleeful Demolition targets. And then Phyrexian Vindicator really helps against Boros Convoke as well for being able to block a large Knight Errant of Eos. So I've liked where this is at. I've been a big fan of Mono White Humans. This one is a deck that I'm going to be really sad to see go because we're losing Thalia, Intrepid Adversary, Adeline, and Brutal Cathar. So like a good chunk of the core of the deck is rotating out, and I will personally miss it. All right, number 6 is Domain, and this one, I haven't had the opportunity to explore it yet. It's one of those that's been kind of on my list. Maybe this will be the week that I explore it. But I covered this one back in week 9 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, so just 2 weeks ago, and there are no changes to this deck, and it really is kind of meta dependent because there are some decks that just absolutely destroy Domain, and then there are some decks that kind of struggle against Domain. So I think if I remember off the top of my head, Domain really struggles with the control matchups, and so if we see more of the Azorius control space coming in, we'll see less of Domain. But right now it preys on mono red quite well because you get a lot of life gain off of the new card that we got, Ancient Cornucopia, and the Lightning Helixes. So definitely I like the direction that Domain's gone from Outlaws of Thunder Junction. I think it's kind of cool. And then the Teferi who slows the sunset with the Celestis also is giving you some life gain. So like the plan is stall until we hit the Sunfall, and then win the game off of Herd Migration and Atraxa Grand Unifier. So the strategy is still the same as it always has been. And nothing new there. But still, one that I want to try checking out. All right, and then down all the way at number 7 is the Mono Red Prowess. And Mono Red Prowess is very similar to Mono Red Aggro, very similar to Gruul Aggro, very similar to the Rakdos Aggro. It's all centered around the Slickshot Show-Off. This one deciding to not run the Fling, so doesn't consistently get as many turn 3 wins, but because it's extending a little bit later with the 3 copies of Godric, does better against some of the matchups, right? So they do have enough of a matchup spread that they're considered opposite or separate decks. So if we compare this one to week 9 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, we can see that they dropped 1 copy of the Fugitive Codebreaker and 1 copy of the Godric Cloaked Reveler. So ditching the 2 creatures as well as the 2 Witchstalker Frenzies, and to play 4 additional copies of Shock. So this one leaning on more heavily into the direct burn with Lightning Strike, play with fire, and the Shocks, all being able to either shoot your opponent's Slickshot Show-Off or shoot their face. All right, and the last deck to kind of summarize the beginning season of Outlaws of Thunder Junction before we go into rotation at Bloomburrow is Azorius Control. And this was number 8 according to Untapped. Personally, I think Azorius Control is looking really good right now because it does answer Mono Red relatively well. Depends on what build of Mono Red we're talking about. But praise well depending on the meta. And so I was actually kind of curious to see it all the way down in the number 8 spot. I think that it has a chance to at least rise, in my opinion. But if we compare this one to the one that I talked about last week in week 10 of Outlaws of Thunder Junction, there's still no changes to this list. And so you've got like the 2 copies of Temporary Lockdown to answer the Boros Convoke matchup. You've got the March of Otherworldly Light, which is good for that matchup as well. You've got the Get Lost and the March and the counter spells to be able to hit the Mono Red Prowess builds. You've got the Sunfalls for the mid-range decks. You've got the Depopulate to kind of help speed that up against the aggro decks. You've got the Tishana's Tidebinder for the mirror match, and you've got the 1 copy of Farewell. We kind of see this one kind of come and go throughout the weeks depending on the pace of the meta. So if you're new and returning to Magic, welcome. Right before rotation, definitely hold off on crafting in my opinion. But if you have crafted all of these cards like I have, because I play a lot of Magic the Gathering, I have lots of wild cards. If you are able to, enjoy all of the different flavors of standard. I've been like a kid in a candy store with how much diversity is in the best of one standard meta right now, right? It's not just one deck that is completely blowing everything out of the water. And there's a lot of rock, paper, scissors, and we kind of see an ebb and flow. And, for a Magic the Gathering nerd like me, it has been a lot of fun. So I hope you have also been having a lot of fun in Outlaws of Thunder Junction. And if you're new here to my community, welcome. Tomorrow I'll be covering the community deck tech, where we had some user submitted decks, and I'll give you some thoughts on those. And if you would like to share your own, look for the link on Tuesday in the community tab. You can also place a vote in the community tab for what you'd like to see next for the Meta Breaker that I cover on Sunday, which one should be covered on the Saturday gameplay video. So enough rambling from me. I hope it wasn't too fast, but I was trying to get this video done in under 45 minutes, and I finished with 5 minutes to spare. So take care, everybody. I'll catch you all next week for a little bit more relaxed meta review, mostly focused on best of one. Ooh, excuse me. Take care, everybody.